Hello, and welcome to today's filmed roundtable discussion on women in leadership in conjunction with International Women's Day 2022. My name is Emma Ogden, and I'm a consultant from the SUMS Group, and we're joined from 5 leaders within the sector who SUMS have worked closely with, including one of our own principal consultants. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the panellists for so kindly giving up their time to share their thoughts and reflections with me around their leadership career. International Women's Day is a time to reflect on progress made, to call for change, and to celebrate acts of success and determination by ordinary women who have played an extraordinary role. Across our client base, we've seen significant improvements to seek a more equitable workforce. Initiatives supported by SUMS include coaching and development support, reviews of practices and processes, and workshops to facilitate opportunities for peer support and learning. But despite this, there is so much more to do, not least because disparities have been exacerbated by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2021, more women than men were furloughed with a loss of pay. There was a 22% fall in paid working hours per day for working mothers in 2020, and current projections suggest it will take 112 years to fully close the gender pay gap. The purpose of this roundtable discussion is to seek the panellists' views on women in leadership and to provide some insight and advice on how current and future female leaders can feel empowered to make a difference and shape a more equal future and recovery from the pandemic. So I'm going to start this morning and go to Professor Jane Harrington, Vice-Chancellor at the University of Greenwich. Professor Harrington, the latest data shows that around 27% of Vice-Chancellors in the UK are women. Would you please share your own reflections on challenges that you have faced to get to the Vice-Chancellor level?
Hello, good morning, Emma. Thank you. Yes, I'd be happy to do that. And I think it's also worth noting that 10 years ago, 24% of women were Vice-Chancellors. So actually, we've seen virtually no change in 10 years. And that's quite a sobering thought. I mean, if I just actually reflect on myself, I think one of the things I would start with and say is, and I think it's probably something that lots of women recognise, I'd argue that actually one of the biggest challenges throughout my career was myself. It was actually the fact that I was first member of my family to go to university. I had very little sort of experience of women like myself in roles like I have now. And for many, many years, I walked around actually believing that somebody would tap me on the shoulder and say, "What are you doing? You know, you shouldn't be doing this job." And I think it took me about 20 years of my career before I got over that, before I actually believed that I actually sat in the right shoes and I had the permission to have the job. And then if I then link on to that, I think the other thing I'd say is one of the big challenges is being pigeonholed. And for many, many years, I was, and I still am, I was a massive advocate for students. I've always been very passionate about the student experience, about how we actually nurture the staff as well within that. And so there was, without a doubt, throughout certainly the early parts of my career, there was a sort of assumption that I would go down a particular route that was a very much more feminized route. And I remember at one point, actually saying to somebody who was trying to push me down a very particular teaching and learning route, which I have nothing against teaching and learning routes, by the way, but it was clearly taking me down a specific trajectory. And actually, I had to persuade them that actually, no, what I really wanted to do was to be a PVC and to be of a faculty, and I wanted to actually have that broader experience. And so I think there's a real danger for women that that's where they can end up. And I also think the other thing for myself was that real challenge. I mean, obviously, we all talk about work-life balance now, but for me, it was about actually proving myself and proving that I was the absolute best at the job without burning myself out. And I have to say, there's been occasions where I haven't got that balance right. And there was, and I'll finish now because I know you want to bring us all in, but there was a particular moment where I was at a session like this, but it was live, and I looked at the front row, and in the front row was a whole row of my colleagues from my workplace, and they asked me the question about work-life balance, and they all started laughing, and I realized then that actually probably I hadn't projected to them that you could actually do things other than just work. And I think that's really important, and I think as women that's a real challenge for us. How do we actually enable others to feel it's okay to have that balance?
Thank you very much, Jane. And I would completely advocate and agree with that point, that there is a significant barrier for women, which is thinking about what they need to prove and also how they need to balance other challenges that go on within their own personal lives. So opening that up to others, or yourself, Jane, what do you think one of the most significant barriers is to women in leadership?
In fact, do you want me to start? I mean, if I start, I mean, I would say one of them is actually yourself. And it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. I think it is actually about how do we enable, and I think programs like Aurora and others that have been very focused on actually giving women resilience and confidence and a belief in themselves. And I think that's really important. And I also think, for me, if I think also about role models, I think they're really important. And I think we have to go beyond what I would say is coaching and mentoring to actually sponsoring women and actually really putting our hand out and helping them through.
Yeah. And I think that concept of allyship, I think, is really important, and growing broader networks of allyship, I think, really help contribute to that thought as well. Has anyone else got any other points they'd like to add? Yep, Sally, we'll go to Sally first and then Ghazwa, if that's okay.
So I agree with everything that Jane is saying, and I recognise a lot of that experience. I just want to challenge the notion that we go into this by talking about the barriers and finding them, because I don't actually find that a very helpful way of going in, because I think it starts from a sort of negative sense that it's terribly difficult and it's uphill and it's going to be hard to achieve it. And actually, I think it's possible to turn that right round and say that leadership is a fantastic opportunity. Women are frequently very good at it. They often network with each other incredibly well. And there's a real argument for actually saying, what more do we want to achieve, recognizing that we're not as far on as we would like to be. But let's be positive about it, because we have every reason to be so. It's frustrating when you look at the percentage of female VCs. I completely agree with that, and I share that frustration. But I actually think that taking a kind of optimistic, positive approach to it is really good for the next generation that are coming up. If they come into this thinking it's going to be terribly hard and there are lots of barriers I'll have to surmount, they're not necessarily going in with the best attitude. So I would like to sort of flip this round and talk about what more should we be doing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point. And I think that really captures the essence of what International Women's Day is about as well. It is about that celebration of success. Ghazwa?
Thanks, Emma. I completely actually agree with Jen and with Sally. You know, it is, if it was, it is a complex issue. I want to go back to the point around tapping colleagues on the shoulder, where we see leadership potential and the difference between equity and equality. Actually, if we were to apply equality, you would tap everyone who's good, and of course we do. But there are groups, and we do see, particularly women of ethnic minorities, where you do need to do that additional tap on the shoulder and say you are good. And you just need to plant that seed, because actually it may never even occur to them that they may be considered, for a position of leadership or for a position of authority. And just and I make a point when I spot colleagues at very, very early in their careers to do that tapping on the shoulder and say, you presented yourself really well in this meeting. You made this point really well. You were great. And actually, think about where you want to be and what you want to do next. Don't just go with the flow. And I think that is important to do. So the barriers is, the women, sometimes ourselves, but also our cultural background and the way we perceive ourselves. So that tap is critical.
Yeah, fantastic. Jane, have you got a final point you want to make?
Yes, I just actually want to come back, because I completely actually agree with what Sally was saying, and I think it's really important that we do actually help support women. And for me, I think it does come back to what I was saying about sponsorship. I do think and I agree with what Gaz has just been saying, about tapping women and recognising, actually, particularly intersectionality, and how difficult it is for some women to believe in themselves or to actually see that they could be in those roles, imagine them in there. And I do think we have a role we can play within that. And for me, if I look back at my career, I was often the first woman to take on particular roles in my institution, or, and that's absolutely fine, but actually I want now to be able to make sure that others aren't like that, and I think we can do that. And I do see more and more women coming through the pipeline, and it's that pipeline. As long as you've got that pipeline, then you will see more women coming through.
Fantastic, thank you all. And I think moving on to the next point, and actually to touch on Sally's reflection, this is now about steering the conversation and moving away from those barriers and thinking about it from a blocking perspective and more of an enabling perspective. So the theme for International Women's Day this year is about breaking down biases and creating a gender equal world, which is free of stereotypes and discrimination, and also celebrates diversity, inclusivity and difference. So I'm going to bring the Chief Operating Officer at Queen Mary University of London, Dr. Ghazwa Alwani-Starr in. Ghazwa, as we look to the next generation of female leaders, what would be your advice to them to help enable this?
Thanks, Emma. It's actually, this question builds really nicely on the conversation that we have just had, because so I started my first leadership position was 1989. As a resident engineer on a construction site in Yorkshire, railway bridge, nighttime possessions, obviously only woman on site in very oversized clothes and oversized shoes because they didn't have anything my size. And so actually, you know, I cut my teeth on leadership in quite a harsh environment. And I guess over the years since then, you know, my career has developed and I have taken opportunities as they've arisen. And I remember sitting in conferences and hearing leaders talk about, you know, career planning, and thinking, really, you know, did I ever plan my career? I didn't actually. I took the opportunities as they arose. But reflecting back on it, I would say it is really good advice to plan your career, because when you plan it, you stand as good a chance of success as you do of failure and not doing as well as you could do. So I think my first piece of advice would be, consider yourself as a leader from early in your career as a woman. Don't worry about how you're going to get there, whether you see yourself in that position, whether anyone else in your family has taken that position. Take the time to consider how far you want to go in your career, and make that decision, and then decide that you know, are you going to be happy and consistently happy with that decision? Because as Jane highlighted, and as, you know, Sally mentioned, that, you know, it isn't going to be an easy journey. Very broad stereotypes. Women are the primary caregivers in culturally. So there will be some compromises that will have to be put in place, and there will be some things that you'll feel that you have to prove yourself harder than the men. Whether you do or not is something else. You feel that you have to do it, and so make that decision and research the options, talk to leaders, spot people that you talk to, and then start to plan your career and act on that decision. Create a path that's going to get you to the leadership position. And there is 3 things that I would say that need to be done. First of all, really start to think about, if you do have caring responsibilities, start to think about having a good support network. You know, when you are sitting in a meeting at 8 o'clock at night, you don't want to be worried whether your kids have had a healthy dinner, whether they've done their homework. You actually, if you are the primary caregiver, you do put a support network to maximize your chances of success. Develop your training and skills and invest in yourself, and keep up to date with your sector news, with what's happening in the sector. You know, stay on top of your game. You do need to stay on top of your game. And training, and I don't mean by training just on a training development in your area, but for example, I'll give the training on unconscious bias. I always believe that training on unconscious bias is as important for people who think they do it to the harm of others as it is for those who may be harmed by it. So when you have got the training and the evidence of what unconscious bias is, then you're able to challenge it in a positive way. You're strong. You feel stronger. You feel more equipped. I'm sorry, my lights have gone, so I think I need to do this kind of thing for them to come back on. So this is going to look great on the.
Don't worry.
And then the third thing I would say is apply for jobs. When you see them, you know, women really wait until they can tick all the boxes on the essential and desirable requirements to apply for jobs. But I always say to women that I mentor, there is no point in applying for a job that you have done in its totality. You want to be aiming about the 70% mark, where you can hit the ground running and delivering for your institution or wherever you're working really quickly. But you've got that 30% that you haven't done before, because that's your own self-development, that's your own, you know, building yourself as you go forward. And of course, men, what, you know, research shows, men will apply if they can tick 2 or 5 boxes. Women really wait until they can tick all 5. So to maximize the pool of opportunity for ourselves is just go for leadership positions, and, you know, apply for them, and you might not be successful first time, but you build your experience, and eventually you get there.
Thank you so much. And I think the point that really resonates with me is that idea of thinking, don't approach this from a negative mindset. Don't approach this from thinking this isn't going to be a possibility, this isn't going to be achievable, but actually see it as, like you said, this is either a learning opportunity for me, or actually I'm going to get there with this. And going in with that mindset I think is a really, really positive thing to take from this. Zoe, can I bring you in?
Yes, thank you, Emma. I just want to add, I think it's also important to picking up on some of the points that Ghazwa's mentioned, is ensuring that you sort of often go for the role, people I mentor go for the role in the role that you want to be in. So for example, when I was at Warwick, I was told that only professors were the programme director for the very prestigious Warwick MBA. And but they were struggling to find somebody to take over that programme director role. So I stepped forward as a senior lecturer. I said, yeah, I thought I can do that job. There's no question I can do that role. You know, I'm an operations management academic by background. I'm good at project management. I'm good at planning. I'm sure I can cope with a load of 20-plus-year-olds that want to be working business and management. So it's about aspiring to do the role that you want to do. So when it came then for my promotion to a reader, etc., they already thought, well, she's doing a role that's substantial in the institution. So therefore it becomes very much, they're sort of not only ticking the box, but the recognition of what you've done. But it's having the support network around you that allows you to do that. So that's one thing that I think is really important. You know, do that role of where you want to be.
Thank you, Zoe. I'll bring Jane in and then we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I completely agree with what's been said. And I think it's really important also sometimes to take sideways jobs. So, yeah, there's always this assumption that your next job always has to be a promotion. Actually, sometimes you need to broaden what you're doing, and that can then help you to get the next promotion. So I'd say to people, don't be afraid. Look, it's a bit like Zoe's just saying, look actually for opportunities, and they can be very different to what you might imagine.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that's a really good point. And actually having that mindset from the outset to understand what that career map might look like for you, or what a possible career journey could be, I think is a really, really strategic way of approaching this. So Professor Radnor, I'm gonna come back to you now for the next question. So inevitably the journey to achieving a gender equal world may be one with some hurdles and milestones. So Professor Radnor, just reflecting on your role, but also the university that you work for, at the University of Law, what would you say the 3 actions are that universities could take which could have the biggest impact on achieving this ambition?
Thank you very much, Emma. And it will come no surprise as we move through these questions. There's going to be a lot of repetition in terms of the points that we give. What's interesting is my background is as an engineer. So I did my first and second degree in engineering, and I've worked in manufacturing environments before I moved into business schools and then into leadership. But what's quite interesting is I've worked in senior management and executive roles in 3 institutions, and I recently moved to University of Law as Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor. But what's interesting here is actually 72% of our academic staff are women, and 68% of our professional services staff are women. So actually we've got gender, with our gender pay gap, is actually in the opposite direction of probably everybody else on this panel, which is quite fascinating. But what I found equally fascinating is when it got to the executive board, we're actually 50-50. We've got 12 people, 6 men and 6 women, and our Vice-Chancellor is a man. So that's quite an interesting point. I'm just going to sort of leave that one hanging when I sort of talk about sort of the 3 actions, and I'm building this also from previous experience. At City University of London, I was Pro-Vice-Chancellor of EDI, and that was an absolutely brilliant role, and I thoroughly, he's talking about widening the opportunities, as Jane mentioned. You know, with the time I took up PVC EDI at City, there were not very many of them in the country. There's a lot more of them now across the sector. So to widen that opportunity to think differently was absolutely fantastic. And I would say a few of the things already been touched on is about, as an institution, you need to create and support networks for all types of different groups with protected characteristics, obviously women as well as part of that. But it's not just creating them to be a network, it's then supporting them in some of the actions and recommendations they come forward with. But it's for them to create that safe space to talk about their lived experience in order to think about how the institution could support them. But then as leaders, it's for us to listen to them to make sure they feel that supported. It's building that resilience and confidence that somebody said earlier. It's also the secondment opportunities, as Jane talked about, sponsoring women. But those secondment opportunities, it is tapping the person on the shoulder. And it's also about giving them opportunity to step up for a little bit and broaden that experience. So I think that's really important as well. And finally, that sort of mentoring and coaching opportunities. And I'm very much about reciprocal mentoring, you know, in the sense that, yes, I'm a woman leader, but I'm of a certain age. And am I in touch with what maybe young women and others are experiencing as they come through? Probably not. I might think I do, but it's a different world that we live in now. So for me, it's reciprocal mentoring, understanding what they're dealing with on a daily basis, as well as giving them some ideas as a leader as well. So I think that is really, really important. I just want to talk a little bit about bias, because that was mentioned earlier. You know, the notion of the bias is well researched and understood, and it's inherent in everything that we do, whether we like it or not. And we've come a long way talking about explicit biases, you know, and understanding those. And we've done lots of institutions to address that, you know, the blind shortlisting, there's leadership programs that many have mentioned, the networks that I've mentioned. But actually, it's some of those unconscious and implicit biases that we still need to tackle. It's those little things like the odd comment that somebody might make in a meeting, the order people are invited into to make a comment, maybe in a meeting or in a forum, particularly in a virtual world. And I think what we need to do is think about that and make sure that us as women leaders, that we allow that allyship, that we call those things out, that we talk about how it makes us feel. You know, I very openly talk about menopause and the challenges, and I make jokes about it. Oh, I can't remember what I said because, you know, but in a way, then what I'm looking for is support from other women, which I do get in helping to us work through some of those challenges, but not in a patronising way, but in a supportive way that's really, really important. I think I finally want to say two things. I think it's really important for us, all the women on this panel, to remember we are role models. You know, whether we want to be or not, we are a role model. And I think we need to recognise that. And we have a duty, I think, to inspire and motivate all women to strive to fulfil their potential, and also for our role in making sure that we shine other women in terms of giving them those opportunities. And for me, when I used to stay at City, and I still believe in this, I feel my role as a woman leader is to allow everyone in the institution to bring their whole selves to work and to study. And I really passionately believe that. And I see myself as a duty as a woman leader to allow that to happen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Zoe. And I think that the point for me that I'm really taking away from that is about how we really recognise and celebrate the benefits that can be gained through female leadership, and acknowledge that and celebrate it. And I think that is ultimately what International Women's Day is about. It is about celebrating the successes that have been made to date, and leading that nicely into kind of my next question it's also about forging inclusive work cultures and where women's careers can thrive and achievements are celebrated. So I want to bring in now Professor Mapstone. So Sally, as the second female principal and Vice-Chancellor at the University of St Andrews, what does this mean to you, and how can this be achieved for other women in the future?
I think my comments are going to build very credibly on the fascinating things that Zoe was just saying, which I would really want to endorse and underscore. I think when you're in a leadership role, like the one that I'm in a very prominent institution that people are very interested in, and there's every opportunity taken to make it appear in the press is taken by the press. I think you have a real responsibility to use that position to show what matters and what matters institutionally. So I do believe that visible leadership is really important, and the linking up of that with diversity is incredibly important. So we have a strategy at St Andrews which I brought in, and it's not organised like standard university strategies, which frankly I find a bit boring. They're all mission and vision, research, education and wider engagement. You could get them off the shelf. So we organise ours thematically. And the second major theme in that, which is built on a consultation that we did right across the university, is diverse St Andrews, and I lead on that institutionally. And I think it's really important to be equated with the values that you represent institutionally. So I lead on a mentoring scheme that we run for senior women in the university. I mentor on it myself. We encourage reciprocal mentoring, as Zoe was describing, but we're also very much concerned with trying to establish sort of networking events that not only enable women to feel that they're benefiting from mentoring, but that they're part of a network, a wider network that will support them. And I think, as we've all been saying, this is actually really important for women, not in a remedial way, but actually in a profoundly enabling and opening up, and actually sometimes quite joyous way. I find it really interesting hearing other women talk about how they have constructed their careers. I'm afraid I don't subscribe to this view that I just waited around and the opportunities came my way. I've met very few successful people that have actually done that. I think we should acknowledge that, as Ghazwa was saying, you should plan, and all right, your plans don't always work out, but there's nothing wrong in admitting that you'd actually like to go on up to the next level. I do think that for other women, and actually for everybody in an institution, decisive interventions that really make everybody think and disrupt the status quo are incredibly important to progress. The one that I have witnessed that was really the most memorable one, I would say, in my entire career was in 2011, when Dame Sally Davis said that applying for future funding from the National Institution of Health Research for medical schools was going to be contingent on having a Silver Athena Swan Award. And when that started, I think there were about 10 medical institutions with Athena Swan Awards. Now there are 145. Some people thought that it was a really sort of cynical intervention to link gender issues with funding, but actually what it did was it made people think. And with Athena Swan, you couldn't get change without culture change. And I think those kind of bold, decisive interventions that are disruptive are really good for getting progress. And I commend Sally Davis for doing that. I used to display her letter very prominently in my office in Oxford when I was there, because for me, it was such a meaningful thing. And I think that every now and then you need to do something like that slightly rocks an institution and makes it look at its values. When I got to St Andrews, I looked very hard at our recruitment exercises, and I took the view that particularly in academia, we were not going to just sit by and let single-sex shortlists go past without saying, no, we're stopping the process and we're going to go back and look, and I'm going to ask you to look quite hard at your recruitment processes and come back. And the first time this happened, there was, a palpable frisson, not only in the room, but institutionally. Now it's part of the norm of what we do. Rightly, I think, absolutely rightly. But again, it was a disruption of the status quo. And I think those are necessary sometimes, absolutely, to generate change. The last thing I want to say is about this work-life balance question, because I think this is a challenging one. I completely subscribe to the view that you need to find that balance. But I think we also do have to accept that leadership brings certain levels of responsibility and commitment that you can't get away from. And I completely recognise what Jane was saying earlier. But I also think for women, it can be really about recognising the value and importance of delegation and trusting in yourself and others. I've just been reading, and please don't think that I was reading this book because I was trying to emulate the person it's about, but I'm reading a fascinating book called Thatcher's People, which is about Mrs. Thatcher and the people around her, who are exclusively male. And one of the striking things that is said about her when she was Education Secretary, it's said by Jim Pryor, I think, in a kind of aside, was that she never delegated. She read every single piece of paper and returned it the next morning. She worked all hours of the day and night. And that is said with a sort of fear on his part, but it's also a syndrome that many women will recognise. It's equivalent to that one of, I can't apply for the job until I've ticked all the boxes.
Yeah. I
think that learning that you can delegate, learning to trust yourself and to trust your team is an incredibly important thing for us to be able to do. I think on occasion it can be more challenging for women for all the reasons that we've discussed today, but the sense of burden falling when you can actually let go and trust those to whom you're delegating is, I think, an incredibly valuable, and I would have to say, still on occasion rather gendered lesson.
Thank you so much, Sally, and I really advocate that point. Into the two sides of it for me is one, thinking about how we can be more disruptive. So thinking about, as Zoe and Ghazwa have talked about, bias, considering what those biases are and how we break those down through either recognising them ourselves or empowering ourselves to educate ourselves better to understand it. But exactly how Sally's talked through, thinking about yourself and maybe barriers that you're putting in front of you in terms of what is hindering my ability to drive and take myself forward. So thank you so much for that. That's really insightful. Ghazwa, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thanks. Really very quickly, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that has just been said, and I actually think that in terms, culturally at the moment, I think we have a moment in time post-COVID that we could really take advantage of. I think what COVID has shown us is that CEOs of multinational companies across the world, men and women, have worked in more flexible ways. So there is a moment in time and an opportunity to really leverage that freedom, really leverage that new way of working that we have had for the last 2 years. Travel, for example, women sometimes don't take on jobs that require a lot of travel. Well, the ice caps are melting. We're zooming away very happily from all corners of the country as we speak. So actually those kinds of barriers, some of the actual practical barriers, have also been challenged now. So I think I would just say there is also a moment in time where we can really leverage that freedom that has been, it's been evidenced. It's now true. We've lived it for 2 years. So let's take advantage of it and take some of those practical barriers away as well.
Yeah.
May I come back very, very quickly, because Ghazwa's point has just made me realise that I should clarify something that I was saying. So I'm grateful to Ghaz for making me think, which is, when I was talking about delegation, I do think the ability to delegate is an incredibly valuable one. I didn't mean to suggest that there is a great relief in just passing on what you have to do to other people, right? I'm not talking about that. It's the capacity to let go, which is good for you, but it also involves respect and fellow feeling for those who are working with you.
Yeah. Fantastic, thanks, Sally. So I'm going to draw us now to our final question, and this is for our SUMS consultant Jeannette Strachan, who has also had considerable experience leading academic registry teams within the sector as well. So Jeannette, reflecting on your own career and experiences, what enablers do you think exist to help grow future talent?
Okay, well, for me, one of the biggest enablers has been the managers over time that I've had. And I want to go back to very early on in my career. When I was in my early 30s, I was a single parent. I had a 10-month-old daughter. And I remember that there was one of my managers who he wanted me to take on extra responsibility. And at that time, I just felt completely overwhelmed. And I said, I can't do this. I can't do this. And his question to me is, what support can we put in place so that you feel able to take on this opportunity? And I thought, what a brilliant question. And by doing that, he opened the door. And I think we all as managers have that responsibility to open the door for people that we manage. The other thing that I was really helped me was secondment opportunities. It's been mentioned a lot, but if I take you back to the 90s, and there was this worry about student information systems, the Millennium Bug, you know, and I was given the opportunity to go on a project around a student information system. Goodness me, has that stood me in good stead throughout my career. So, you know, take those opportunities because they broaden your horizons. The other thing I would say is about networking. We're really fortunate in higher education that we've got great professional networks. And you know, my advice to anyone would be to use them. Because I remember, you know, when you're first an academic registrar and everyone thinks that you are the font of all knowledge, and you're sitting there thinking, I'm really not. That ability to be able to ring someone up at another institution who's been through it is fantastic and a great resource. So networking. The other thing is, I think it's really important that you never stop learning, and I've never stopped learning. You know, I had the opportunity, and because we work in higher education, we often get these opportunities. I had the opportunity to do an MBA, which I grasped. I had the opportunity to go on the Aspiring Registrars Programme, which is a mix of coaching and learning sets. I learned a huge amount, and you know, Emma, I've just gone on a coaching course, and I think it's about learning throughout your career, isn't it? And I think the other point I would make is about the role of inspirational role models. So, you know, I look back to my grandmother who, during the First World War, she was a secretary at a wine import company, and all the guys went off to the front, and she suddenly became director of that company, you know. So she brought me up with that ethos, you can do anything. You know, and I think if I look at a more modern example, you know, myself and actually my daughter as well are great fans of Sheryl Sandberg. You know, she's a great role model for women. You know, and her thing about we need to get more women in these senior positions, and you know, we recognise the obstacles, but it's about pushing beyond those barriers, isn't it? And going into places where actually sometimes you don't feel comfortable, and that's okay.
Thank you so much. And I really like your final thoughts on people that we can look to and aspire to and look as role models, because I think that's really important, that we don't just look within ourselves and kind of let our heads take over and let that influence our decision making, but have that willingness and openness to see what other people have achieved, or have that ability to even ask people within our network, because my experience is 9 times out of 10 someone else has either experienced exactly the same thing or is going through it at that particular moment in time. And there is, for some reason, we do sometimes prevent ourselves from doing that. We do have a barrier in asking for help or reaching out to other people just to have that peer support network. So thank you so much for that, and I just want to kind of close by thanking you all so much for your comments, thoughts, and recommendations and insight. I've really enjoyed this communication and this opportunity to hear everyone's thoughts, and I'm incredibly grateful for your time. So today's roundtable discussion has provided some valuable insight and will be accompanied by a blog piece which will shortly be available on the SUMS website, and that will provide further advice from these remarkable women as well as others. Other support such as coaching and development is available through SUMS as well. So if you'd like to know more or are interested in this, please do contact me, and I'm more than happy to discuss this further. The question has never been whether women can lead as capably as men. Women have always led, especially when times have been more challenging, as Jeanette's just talked to. The question which remains, however, is why women's leadership remains invisible. And I've gained so much insight from the perspectives today, which I think goes some way to tackling this issue and to celebrate and promote the incredible work and efforts of women within this sector. So I just want to close by thanking you all again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.